of Seventh-day Adventist Theology, Frank Holbrook says Satan, formerly Lucifer, was a, quote, highly exalted angel, end quote, who carries on the conflict with heaven by means of his new allies, sinful humanity. While it is controversial in some places, Questions on Doctrine fits easily within the traditional Adventist theology when it says, quote, as to Satan, or the devil, we hold the uniform teaching of the Word to be that he is definitely a personal being, the supreme adversary of God and man, end quote. The eighth fundamental belief of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is, in part, all humanity is now involved in a great controversy between Christ and Satan regarding the character of God, his law, and his sovereignty over the universe. This conflict originated in heaven when a created being, endowed with freedom of choice, in self-exaltation became Satan, God's adversary, and led into rebellion a portion of the angels. He introduced the spirit of rebellion into this world when he led Adam and Eve into sin. Under this view, Satan could be compared to the White Witch, the primary antagonist in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Like the White Witch, Satan is a person who tempts and otherwise interacts with humans in order to do them harm. These actions are carried out as part of a greater conflict with Christ, allegorized as Aslan in Lewis's book. Some have proposed that in the Gospel according to John, the controversy is less personal. Rather than a demonic entity tempting Jesus, the fourth Gospel speaks of darkness and night. Even when Satan, or the devil, is named in John's Gospel, he is not portrayed as directly attacking Jesus or his followers. This led Alan Culpeper to conclude that in John, quote, primarily the conflict is between Jesus, who is from above, and those who cannot and will not recognize his identity, end quote. Similarly, James Ramsey Michaels states, the perspective of John's Gospel as a whole suggests that the darkness is equivalent to the world. In this view, the adversary is more like Sauron from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Working from the shadows, more force than personality, Tolkien's Sauron rarely speaks. The corrupting presence of this enemy is felt, and his minions are encountered, but we see no individuality. The controversy in this view is between Christ and evil as a concept, rather than an evil being. Such a view runs counter to the traditional Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the cosmic conflict. This paper will attempt to show, that in the fourth Gospel, Satan is more White Witch than Sauron. In order to do this, I borrow heavily from the narrative critical methodology used by R. Alan Culpeper in his Anatomy of the Fourth Gospel. This approach is supplemented by Craig Koster's systematization of the function of Johannine symbols. With this methodology, the reader is encouraged to consider the point of view of the narrator, the characterization of the people in the story, and the literary force of recurring symbols. These literary devices allow us to see how John views Satan. Omniscience in John's Gospel. The Gospel of John is like other biblical books in having an omniscient narrator who both knows cosmic truths, like the origin of the world, and the interior lives of various characters. Culpeper calls the narrator omniscient, omnipresent, reliable, and stereoscopic. Similarly, Francis Maloney says of the fourth Gospel, quote, the narrative is held together by the point of view of an omniscient and omnipresent implied author who is part of the narrative itself, end quote. Mirek Shinall and Christopher Hallam have questioned the reliability of the narrator. They point out that the narrator intentionally keeps information from the audience, as when it is reported after the fact that Jesus healed on Sabbath. However, in the end, they conclude that the narrator is not unreliable, but rather, quote, tricky, ready and willing to surprise the reader with an unexpected revelation, end quote. In other words, the narrator at times waits to give the complete truth in order to lead the reader to a deeper understanding of Jesus and his deeds. The omniscient narrator is able to inform the reader of spiritual realities that are not evident to the human characters in the narrative. Through this omniscience, we learn that it was the devil's plan for Judas to betray Jesus in 13:2. From an earthly perspective, the betrayal was committed by one of Jesus' closest followers. But the narrator tells us the devil is ultimately responsible. Judas does not simply act as a representative of Satan in John's gospel. He is controlled by Satan. John 13:27 tells us that Judas takes the final step in betraying Jesus only once Satan entered into him. Judas is the instrument through which Satan exerts his will upon Jesus' story. Like the White Witch sending her emissaries to harry the Pevensie children, Satan uses Judas to accomplish his plan. In addition to the omniscience exhibited by the narrator, Jesus also demonstrates a knowledge of spiritual and metaphysical realities. It is his particular omniscience that explains why Jesus is the only character in John's gospel to refer directly to the adversary. He recognizes the devil-like quality in Judas in 670, and later accuses the unbelieving crowd of being children of the devil. This latter accusation is leveled because they imitate the devil in their desire to kill Jesus. Because Jesus knows and recognizes spiritual realities, he can identify the source of the crowd's murderous intention. Unlike anyone else in the narrative, he recognizes the true enemy, the one who uses unbelievers to threaten his own life. Jesus sees how Satan's power lies behind earthly authorities. He speaks of the ruler of this world as someone whose judgment is imminent. This title is unique within the New Testament, but is rooted in Jewish apocalypticism. By coming from above down to the earth, Jesus has entered hostile territory. He comes as an invading force to bring the present ruler, Satan, to justice. But this ruler will not give up without a fight. Jesus predicts, "I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming," 14:30. Though Jesus and Satan are diametrically opposed, Jesus knows and understands the plan of his enemy. It is notable that Jesus predicts that the ruler himself would come. Wilson Peroshki notes, the unmistakable reference to Satan was a warning that he was coming personally and in the actions of Judas. Thus, in John's Gospel, Jesus understands that a literal, personal enemy, the ruler of this world, was seeking to destroy him. Another possible reference to Satan comes in Jesus' prayer for his followers. In John 17:15, Jesus asks that God keep them from tu poneru. This articular adjective could either be masculine or neuter. If it is masculine, the clause would mean keep them from the evil one, referring to Satan. If neuter, then it would be a request that God keep them from evil. Barnabas Linders points out the similar phrases in the first epistle of John that clearly refer to the evil one, masculine. In the context of John 17, Jesus is drawing a distinction between the world and the disciples who are not of the world. Given Jesus' previous statements regarding the ruler of the world and the parallels with 1 John, tu poneru, I believe, is best understood as a masculine substantival adjective referring to Satan. Much like the White Witch, the devil in John's Gospel is not only the enemy of Jesus, but also of those who follow Jesus. Light and darkness. Commentators have long noted the dualism in John's Gospel, the dichotomies of life, death, above, below, and especially light and darkness color the theology of the fourth Gospel. John shows a special interest in concepts involving light and darkness, with over half of the uses of light-darkness terminology in the Gospels occurring in his book. It is to the light-darkness dichotomy that scholars have pointed to show John's moral dualism. Raymond Brown, commenting on the saying in John 12:35 that the disciples would walk while they're in the light, says the light-darkness motif moves the discussion from the intellectual realm to the moral realm. Maloney omits Satan from the discussion of sin and darkness when he says, quote, "The doing of evil, or the doing of good, is not the result of living in the light. One does evil because one loves the darkness, and therefore chooses it, hiding one's own ambiguity in the darkness," end quote. They see the darkness as a moral concept, or as the absence of Jesus, rather than an entity antithetical to Jesus. The darkness motif serves as a primary piece of evidence for those who see the adversary in John as a force rather than a personality. And I don't deal with this in the paper because I wanted to keep this in the time limit. But another piece of evidence is the fact that there are no exorcisms in John's gospel. That exorcism is a very key part of the miracles that Jesus does in the Synoptics, but not in John. And so they talk about that. Unfortunately, I didn't really have time to go into that in this paper. John introduces the light-darkness dichotomy in his prologue. In John 1:5, we are told that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Jörg Frey is correct that here and elsewhere in the gospel, the focus is on the light and the life, whereas the negative opposite is only the dark foil on which the light can shine. Yet despite the emphasis being on the light, there is still information that can be gained about John's view of the darkness. In this verse, it is implied that the darkness attempted to overcome the light. The verb katalambano most often has a personal agent as its subject, although there are some exceptions. Because of these exceptions, the agency of the darkness can be an open question. But at minimum, John 1:5 tells us the darkness metaphorically opposes the light. Although its parallel goes unstated, the statement that life was the light of people in 1:4 could imply that the darkness leads to death. Elsewhere in John's Gospel, we learn that the darkness is present where Jesus is absent. When the disciples embark on the boat, the narrator informs us it was now dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. 6:17. The prologue has prepared the reader to understand John's statement as more than a simple meteorological observation. The two clauses are connected. Just as the world without Jesus is in darkness, so are the disciples in darkness when Jesus is not with them. Jesus makes the point explicit several times when he informs his audience that he came for the purpose of bringing people out of darkness. From these verses we learn that darkness is not simply the antithesis of the light, rather it is the antithesis of Jesus, the light of the world. The night serves a similar literary purpose to darkness in John's Gospel. Nicodemus approaches Jesus at night, representing his initial status of unbelief, which is remedied by meeting Jesus. John later reminds the reader that Nicodemus had come to Jesus by night, reaffirming the importance of the symbolism. Nicodemus thus represents those who leave the darkness by coming to Jesus. Mary visits the tomb at night while it was still dark, 20 verse 1, and runs away, verse 2. Commenting on this element of the resurrection story, Maloney says, quote, "In the darkness, a setting of unfaith, Mary runs away from the tomb," end quote. Yet, despite this momentary fear, Mary's faith is strengthened when she encounters Jesus, the bringer of light, in the garden. This meeting transforms Mary's message from one of desperation and powerlessness, "They have taken the Lord," to joy and self-assurance, "I have seen the Lord." Meeting Jesus brings her from night into day. Finally, after the resurrection, Peter and the other disciples are incapable of catching fish during the night. When Jesus appears and day arrives, 21 verse 4, everything changes. They catch more fish than they can imagine. Repeatedly in John's Gospel, we see movement toward Jesus symbolized by day overcoming night. The opposite is also true. There are those who choose to walk in darkness. Jesus says, if someone walks in the night, they will stumble, because the light is not in them. This explains why it is necessary to work in the day, not at night. Only work done in the light with Jesus will prosper. To borrow from the language of the vine and the branches metaphor, apart from the light, we can do nothing. Life lived in darkness is regrettable, but choosing to move from light into darkness is tragic. And this occurs when Satan enters Judas. The disciple departs the presence of Jesus and enters the night. 13:30. The character arcs of Nicodemus and Judas are diametrically opposed. Nicodemus begins in the dark of night and moves toward Jesus. Judas is first mentioned as a disciple of Jesus in 671, and thus begins the narrative in the light. His story ends with him walking into the night, and then at night betraying the Savior. The torches carried by the mob are a poor substitution for the true light. Just as light and day serve as a metaphor for one's connection with Jesus, darkness and night, at a minimum, represent absence from Jesus. John uses the metaphors of light and darkness to illustrate the decision every person must make. The gospel issues a challenge to the reader. Will we walk in the light or remain in the darkness? Regarding the personhood of Satan in John's gospel, the parallel to Jesus as the personification of light is Satan as the personification of darkness. This conclusion is strengthened by the fact that Judas only leaves Jesus and enters into darkness once Satan entered into him. Conclusion. This paper has attempted to show that in John's gospel, Satan is more white witch than Sauron. He is a being that can and will be judged. The devil's agency is shown by his interaction with Judas. While evil is spoken of symbolically as darkness, this does not imply that evil is simply a force or an impersonal power. Just as the light in John's gospel represents Jesus and his influence upon those who follow him, so darkness represents Satan and the influence he exerts upon those under his purview. One's allegiance is not predestined, and there is movement between camps, as with Nicodemus and Judas. Like Edmund in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, those who walk in darkness can choose to repent and come to the light. This analysis of John's portrayal of Satan accords well with the traditional Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of the Great Controversy meta-narrative. The war between Christ and Satan is personal, in that each side acts with agency for their own purposes. They both seek to influence humanity. Walking in the light with Jesus leads to love. Walking in the darkness with Satan results in betrayal and death. At least as it relates to the fourth gospel's understanding of the devil, the cosmic conflict is up to date. Thank you.